Welcome. We're back again, and we're very lucky to have him with the world in flames, as it were. Professor James Kurth, Professor Emeritus at Swarthmore College, who has taught at Swarthmore, Harvard, UC San Diego, and the U.S. Naval War College, who received his doctorate under Samuel P. Huntington at Harvard after he went to Stanford, and who's been at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, the editor of Orbis, an advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, and a world traveler who's visited more than 50 countries, as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and an elder at Proclamation Presbyterian Church in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, to talk to us today about what on earth is going on in Ukraine, and what does it mean for us in the United States, and what does it mean for the world? And before we go to the questions, I just want to say Professor Kurth is also the author of this fantastic book, The American Way of Empire, How America Won a World but Lost Her Way, which was published in 2019 by our company, Washington Books, and it's available in paperback, Kindle, as an audiobook on audible.com. And if you look in the index, there are quite a few references to Ukraine. In addition to that, in addition to publishing hundreds of articles on foreign policy and strategy and so forth, Professor Kurth reminded me that when he was an undergraduate at Stanford, he wrote a massive term paper on Soviet nationalities policies in the Ukraine in the 1950s. So this is a subject matter, and in the dissertation, I believe, or the thesis was on the Habsburg Empire, which is also relevant to the Ukraine, a field which Professor Kurth has been, I think, involved with in some capacity or another almost all of his adult life, which I didn't realize the last time I talked to him. There's probably no one more qualified to talk about Ukraine than Jim Kurth. So we're lucky to have him. We're honored to have him. We're happy to have him. And I just wanted him to weigh in, as I've been watching hundreds of different things on my social media, but also watching YouTube videos from other organizations, including Jewish organizations, which seem to have been dragged into defending the Biden administration, which is about to give, as far as I can tell, the atom bomb to Israel's major enemy, Iran. And yet they're all singing from the same sheet, praising Biden, condemning Putin, accusing Russia of anti-Semitism because they're attacking Zelensky, when in fact there are more Jews in Russia than there are in Ukraine. And Putin has been a very good friend to Israel and helped Israel many times. And the Israeli government itself is trying to be a little bit more neutral. So we have a paradox of American Jewish organizations hosting people, attacking Russia, attacking Trump. In two of the presentations I saw, well, one with Jordan Peterson was Robert Kagan. He's not from a Jewish organization, but he happens to be Jewish and married to Victoria Nuland, who's one of the people in this. But both people made references to things like the bombing of Baba Yar, which did not happen, and why would they? And trying to stoke Jewish hatred of Russia based on ancient Tsarist pogroms and Stalin's anti-Jewish policies. That said, I just hope that the Jewish community comes to their senses and adopts a more nuanced and objective view of what's going on. And hopefully this presentation will provide some background, some perspective, and some understanding of the larger forces, both historical, social, military, and political at play. With that introduction said, we're welcoming and grateful to have you, Professor Kurth. If you could just start at the beginning by telling us, you have a theory of 7 stages in the historical development of the United States and the world right now. And what stage are we at and what comes next?
Well, thank you very much, Larry. I'm happy to be talking about these. Happy is not quite the word, since the topics are so grim and somber, and I'm afraid we haven't seen anything yet. They'll get even more grim and more somber in the days and the weeks ahead, not just for the Ukrainians, but for a good many other people around the Western Hemisphere, including ourselves. But the reference you mentioned to 7 stages, That's a conception I developed at the beginning of what might be called the coronavirus siege that began just 2 years ago, roughly this week. That is to say, the first or second week of March in 2020. And at that particular time, when it was quite clear that the United States, joining other countries that had been afflicted before, China, Italy, Spain, that the United States would be joining these other countries being under siege of this new virus, the coronavirus. And I developed a kind of conception of what there would be in what I thought already then would be eventually seen as the coronavirus catastrophe, that within that, there would be a series of stages of successive but also cumulative crises. Now, the obvious first crisis would be the medical crisis. That was after all, that was the nature of the coronavirus. That was posing a medical crisis. But I could see from a study of history of earlier medical crises of a big sort, plagues, epidemics, pandemics, that sort of thing, that would then lead to an economic crisis. So the second crisis would be the economic crisis. That in turn would lead to a political crisis. The political crisis would be characterized by an increasing fragmentation, polarization in a political system. And of course, at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, our political system was already highly fragmented, polarized, dysfunctional. And the coronavirus crisis, or rather the political crisis that issued from the earlier economic, that issued from the medical, that would therefore take what was already serious flaws and could well turn them into fatal flaws. All the more so, since this political crisis would occur in an already fevered electoral year. And it seemed a matter of time, only a matter of time until as we move towards the end of summer and the electoral season in the fall of 2020, and then the election itself, that there would be serious strains on the political system, analogous to strains in other countries when they may be on, 3 or 4 years before a civil war that has broken out. And so that did exactly happen. Now, it was somewhat worse than I had thought. I hadn't predicted, for example, all the political stresses that would occur with Black Lives Matter and the demonstrations in dozens, maybe even hundreds of American cities and towns in the summer of 2020. That was new. I had not expected that. But I certainly had thought that there would be a problem as we approached the election, and that each side would accuse the other of stealing the election. And that would mean whatever the results was of the presidential election, roughly half of the population, the losing part of the electorate, would consider the new president illegitimate, that he and his party had stolen the election. And so that did come along quite on schedule, although I had not predicted that the election would last so long. In other words, from the election day all the way down to, yes, January 6th. And I hadn't predicted that there would be the demonstration at the Capitol, and that there would be this very radically different interpretations of what happened. Some people call it, as I just did a moment ago, this was a demonstration that got a little out of hand. On the other hand, the partisans of Biden, and more broadly, the people who follow the lead of the Democratic National Committee, they're telling us it's an insurrection. So even the quite unusual, if you will, demonstration or riot that occurred on January 6th, that itself has contributed to the fragmentation of the system, not only because it happened, because it reinforces the conflicting narratives of just what's reality here. Well, it was very clear from the basis of historical comparisons that when a political system really gets dysfunctional, and there are great powers or revisionist powers outside the borders of this particular great power that's become dysfunctional, that leads to a strategic crisis. That's the fourth crisis, the strategic crisis, where one or more of the revisionist powers takes advantage of the fragmentation, dysfunction of the political system of their major adversary, and then make a move to revise, that's where the word revisionist, revise the international order, especially in their own local region, to take advantage of the dysfunction of the status quo great power that has hitherto prevented them from doing it. Now, that's what we're undergoing now. We're undergoing the strategic crisis. And there are three major revisionist powers that each have a grievance against the United States because the United States stands in its way of reclaiming, that is, revising borders that had put it back from what had been its historical sphere of influence. Now, with the Chinese, it's fairly obvious. They're the largest and most powerful of the revisionist powers. They have claims, yes, to the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and then the hinge of fate between them, that is Taiwan. They believe those areas have always been in the Chinese realm, and that it was the West and the 100 years of humiliation, also the Japanese, of course, that stole them away. And the time has come to reclaim that. With the Russians, obviously with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, but beyond that, the breakdown of what had been the empire of Tsarist Russia, all those countries that broke away from the Soviet Union had been not only under the Soviet Union, but had been under Imperial Russia, under the Tsars in the 100 years or more before. And so the Russians wanted to reclaim their version of a sphere of influence. That doesn't necessarily mean that they want to incorporate them into a new Russian empire or a new Soviet Union. That theme is out there in the discussion. But it does mean that all great powers want to have on their borders buffer states that are governed by governments that are friendly to friendly. I'm using language often used even in the diplomatic things, friendly governments. And the Russians wanted that in this particular region, what they call their near abroad. And yes, the Ukraine is in that, Georgia is in that, and perhaps to come as a point of conflict with the West, the Baltic states are in that. So all of those are areas in which the Russian government, just like every prior Russian government and regime, want to have friendly governments in those states. And at the moment, with the exception of Georgia, they're decisively unfriendly. That's a problem. With Iran, they want to extend what Iranian or Persian powers have wanted to have for 2,500 years. That is to say, a sphere of influence, successive layers of proxies stretching from the Iranian plateau around Tehran and earlier Isfahan and Persepolis, stretching all the way to the west to the Mediterranean. That's the classic thrust, the drive to the Mediterranean. From Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. Persian and now Iranian regimes have sought that whenever they had the power to do that. Now, what stands in the way of that? Well, Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so they're gnawing away in the Persian way through their proxies and also through their deception. The proxies getting Shiites in Arab countries to be part of their allies, such as the militias in Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and indirectly, I mean, this is quite remarkable, but it shows their mastery of mastering proxies. They have a Sunni proxy in Hamas, which is south of Israel, just like Hezbollah, a Shiite proxy, more in keeping with them, is to the north. And so it was no accident that last May, there was this 11-day war between Israel and Hamas. All of that had been backed. All of that had been pre-programmed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And as soon as Biden, who they thought would be soft on Iran, and also would be presiding of an extremely fractured American political system, as soon as he was inaugurated, they started the process of step by step the demonstrations, the provocations that would occur in late April and early May, and then that erupted into the 11-day war between Hamas and Israel. Now, that was rather short. It didn't have the dramatic consequences of what we're seeing in Ukraine now. And it certainly didn't have the dramatic consequences of what we might see vis-a-vis Taiwan and China in the future. But you can see the pattern. You can see the pattern. The three revisionist powers, each in their own way, are looking for a way that they can take advantage of the dysfunction. Now, one last subtlety on this is they all know that all of them will want to do that. But of course, the really wise, seasoned 2,500 years or more of kind of strategy of reclaiming temporarily, in their minds, lost lands. The really patient powers, most obviously, most patient, most experienced of all, China, less patient, less experienced, Persia, i.e. Iran, and yes, least patient, most impetuous, Russia. They've, after all, only been a great power for 400 years. And so they all knew it would be best if someone else initiated the revisionist process with the United States. The United States would become completely focused on that country. And then in all the dust, as the United States is struggling with, maybe fighting that other country, then they can make their move in the fog of war in their own realm. That's what happened. Both the Chinese and the Persians, Iranians, both knew it's very likely would Russia make the move first, because that's the Russian way. And so they're sort of have their heads beneath the trench line now, hoping nobody will notice. But they're each is positioning themselves to make a big move, either getting a nuclear weapon for Iran, or Chinese are very patient, simply tightening the noose around Taiwan and establishing their de facto greater and greater power denial capability in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. That's the Chinese way. But at the end of all of this conflict between the United States and Russia, then they will be in better strategic positions and will be in worse in their own realms.
Right. Well, thank you for the big picture. Now, if we can zoom in a little bit with Ukraine, where are we now in Ukraine and how does it fit into this process?
Well, as I've indicated, for overdetermined reasons, several layers of history, some layers being much greater in length backward than others, for overdetermined reasons, you might say that, well, one does say that from the Russian perspective, Ukraine is not only a vital interest of Russia, but it's the most vital interest. In other words, from the point of view of Russia, Ukraine is sort of like what we might consider to be Texas, except Texas was not the origin of American kind of identity, the American Revolution, the American Constitution, whereas Kievian Rush was the origin of Russian identity. In other words, the Rush people who developed around Kiev more than 1,000 years ago under Prince Vladimir the Great. Now, Putin has referred to Prince Vladimir the Great, hoping, of course, that people will notice that his name is Vladimir. Ah, yes, but the president of Ukraine, Vladimir, that, of course, is Ukrainian for Vladimir. So you see, we have a struggle between the two Vladimirs over who's the rightful heir to the original Vladimir. Now, they all agree that Vladimir was very great indeed. He was the founder of the kind of consciousness, and since he converted to Christianity, the Christian Orthodox identity of the people that would come, be they eventually called Ukrainians or be eventually they called Russians or both. Of course, the Russians think Ukrainians are merely a variation on a Russian theme. And the Ukrainians think, well, the Russians are a little bit upstarts. They don't really understand the fullness, the richness of the civilization of Kievan Rus. The Russians today don't understand that real Rus people are Kievan Rus. So that means that this is a vital interest of Russia, and Putin knows the history. And indeed, in August, he even published an essay, a very historically grounded essay, some 70 pages. Now, of course, it's likely that many scholars wrote it for him, but there's no doubt about it that the thesis, the theme, even the style is very much in the Putin brain. And incidentally, real Russian leaders show amongst all the other powers and processes and power and kind of strengths and depths that they have, they always show they too are intellectuals. They can speak in the language of the patriotic intelligentsia, not just of some party hack or not just some military general. They can speak those languages too, but they're intellectuals, they're scholars. Even Stalin made a show of, actually it was sincere in his case, made a show of a full knowledge of the great Russian literature, of the great Russian music, of the great Russian architecture. Putin really knows Russian culture, and he tries to demonstrate it where he can. Now, of course, that's only one part of his identity, but I'm just saying, when he presented in a number of different arenas, most recently, the speeches that he gave as he made and announced the decisions, first on Monday, on the 21st of February, that he was going to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk and send troops into, Russian troops in to protect them. Then on Thursday, the 25th, on both of those occasions, he gave a 1-hour speech, really a lecture that was a summary of what he had written before, and to explain why he was doing this and in the process fulfilling Russia's identity, Russia's destiny. So that's part of a very elaborate, very substantiated legitimation process.
And what about the other Vladimir in the conflict between the two Vladimirs?
Well, I've already alluded to the fact that the Rus, the descendants of Vladimir the Great, the Rus, be they what Russians often call the Great Russians, that's the Russians, the Little Russians, the Ukrainians, and the White Russians, the Russians, those are three variations on a Russian theme. The Tsars called themselves Tsar of all the Russians. Now, when the Great Russians call themselves the Great Russians, the Ukrainians call themselves the Little Russians, they don't mean that the Ukrainians are little people. They simply mean that's a much smaller area than big area of Russia, and a smaller number of people. Now, from the point of view of the Ukrainians who take their Kievan Rus identities very central, and incidentally of the various regions of Ukraine, the one that does that the most is the central region around Kiev. For the Ukrainians who take that identity very seriously, they think that the Great Russians, the large number of Russians to the north, that they're really only semi-civilized, semi-cultured. Why, it's sort of like, what dare I say, New Englanders or people in greater Philadelphia, mid-Atlantic region, what they think of Texans. Well, of course, Texans are Americans, and they've got a lot of good qualities. Well, they have a lot of entrepreneurs, and they've got good soldiers. But, you know, they're not really very cultured. They don't understand what really are the rules and norms, the traditions and customs that make for our wonderful liberal democracy that was originated in New England and in Philadelphia and Virginia. So you see, I would say that the Ukrainians look upon the Russians the way that the people around me, like at Swarthmore or at Harvard or at Princeton, look upon the Texans. I can say this. I have lived here in Philadelphia, in Swarthmore, Greater Philadelphia, now for almost 50 years, 48 years. In that 48 years, I've never heard anybody sort of who grew up in this area or have come from afar and sort of want to acclimatize, assimilate themselves to the norms of this area. In 48 years, I've never heard a good word about Texans. Well, you can see why the Ukrainians think the Russians are just kind of primitive, they're clods.
Well, let's bring the focus a little sharper, because we now have a military conflict. The two Vladimirs are fighting. What do you think this means for the military dimension?
Oh, this is very important. Now, just as I was implying, much of what the commentators in the West would call Putin's foreign policy is really the foreign policy of a wider, what I would call Russian national security establishment. And beyond that, an even wider Russian socioeconomic establishment. And beyond that, even wider, the Russian people. Most of what he said in these historical analyses that I've mentioned, including those two speeches, not everything he said, but most of what he said, this is the sort of thing that most Russians already believe. They were taught that in primary school, secondary school. They just assume it's a self-evident truth. Sort of the way, until recently, the famous 1619 project, but you had generations of Americans who were taught civics, what might be called the 1776 project. And that was a self-evident truth about self-evident truths. And so that is a very broad thing. But and as I say, this is very much a part of our Russian identity, not just a couple party hacks or cronies of Putin, or not just Putin himself. It's a wider national perspective. Now, what does that mean in terms of the military? Well, I believe that every major military has what might be called a national strategic culture, a distinctive national way of thinking about security, strategy, war. It also has, in carrying that out, a national operational code. That's the operations and tactics by which they do it. Now, although Americans don't normally think about it, there really is a distinctive American national strategic culture, an American way of war. If we fight it in our American way of war, we usually do well, but we haven't done that for a long time. That's why we're doing so badly. We're trying to do something that doesn't really fit into our comparative strengths. Now, there is a distinctive Russian national military culture, and there's a strategic culture, and there is a distinctive operating code, the way they carry out their operations. And this is different than other great powers like the Chinese or the United States in earlier days when the Germans and the French and the British were great powers. They had their own distinctive ones. Now, what is this? This is very dangerous and very ominous. The Russian way of war has always emphasized, this goes back to Peter the Great and every regime since, they always were confronting some great power or powers to the West that were more modern and more advanced in whatever was the culture, the technology of the day. And several of these great powers, especially if they were close to Russia, wanted to take advantage of their advancement in the whatever was the modernity of the day and invade Russia and break off pieces of that. And so the Russians have always been faced with adversaries to the West that are smaller in size, but are more modern, more advanced, more skilled, including in the arts of war. So the Western armies have quality, and the Russians can't match them on that. So they match them with quantity. They take the mentality of the intelligence, if you will, of the Western armies, and they match it with the mass, the kind of brawn opposed to the brain that the Russians can provide. That's a distinctive Russian way of war, overwhelming the Western invaders with their mass, because they always had a lot more men and maybe not a lot more material in the sense of advanced weapons, but given all their resources, enough material to have a lot of something. Now, and I'll get to that in a second. So in other words, this is the distinctive Russian way of war. Now, this means they're very good at, on the eve of a war, putting a big mass on their borders to protect it or to advance beyond it. Well, that's good. And incidentally, the particular materiel or weapon system that the Russians have always emphasized ever since the 18th century is artillery. Artillery. They have larger number of guns and they lay down more firepower on their adversaries than their adversaries can return. That's, in other words, masses of firepower delivered on the adversary. That is the operating aspect of this culture. Now, those are the strengths, but there's a problem. Logistics. Now, most military analysts always focus on the weapons, on the soldiers, on the firepower. Kinetic warfare is, to use the phrase that we often use nowadays about that old-fashioned 20th century war, kinetic warfare. Well, actually, though, you have to have logistics that gets that mass to the frontier and beyond, and to sustain it. That logistics that gets the men, you feed them and clothe them, and the materiel, the rockets, and in one day, not the artillery. In one day, artillery, and you had to have horses that would draw that forward. Logistics. And then later, like in World War II, well, you added onto the artillery these artillery-style rockets. The Soviets were superb at laying down massive barrages of rockets, the Katyusha rockets on the Wehrmacht. But you had to get them there somehow. Well, that's where the Russians have a problem. Logistics, especially the more modern you get, requires more and more organization. Well, Western powers, being more modern, and especially if they're obsessed with this, like the Prussians and the Germans, or in their own way, superb at it, like the Americans, they're very good at logistics. The Russians, not so much. And the eve of every battle, and then when the battle begins, something always goes wrong. Why, you might say, the Russians always run out of gas. Now, the discerning knew that would happen this time, and it did. And so therefore, you see, one of the reasons why you have that convoy 40 miles long, stretched out on that highway, that straight highway from just north, the Belarus part, the Russian part, just north of Kiev, why you have that convoy stretched out there, sitting there for 4 days, not moving, is because they simply don't have the fuel to do it, or their trucks or artillery or armored personnel carriers broke down. They don't have the logistical apparatus to repair them in the field, and they don't have the food and the clothes for their men. And so the whole thing has degenerated into a typical Russian chaos where you have to depend upon logistics. Now, the Russians know that. I'll say what Putin, he learned that after Georgia. The successful in one sense, achieving some objectives, but a failure in another sense, the Russian army's operations in those little stateless areas of northern Georgia was completely unprofessional, completely ridiculous, one screw up after another. I'll say something more about what Putin tried to do and what he failed in doing, because he was given a bill of goods by his defense secretary, minister, which I can mention. But when the Russians get stymied, they run out of fuel, but they happen to be in front of their enemy, be it the enemy an army or be it the enemy a city, well, then they default to their strength, which is unload the firepower. Every time they get stymied, then they unload the firepower. They even did over their own city, a city named after their own leader, Stalingrad, in 1942-43. The Germans had occupied Stalingrad. The Russians wanted to reconquer it. They ran out of supplies and fuel. It was the winter. The winter can be bad in Russian soldiers, just like in German soldiers. And they ran out of that, but they were on the outskirts of Stalingrad, so they bombed it. They blew it to pieces. But it was their own city. Well, they continued that as the Germans began to learn one city after another. They did that in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad. They did that in Danzig, now Gdansk. They did that in Breslau, now Wrocław. And above all, they did it in Berlin. Any city that Hitler said, this is a fortress city, and therefore it resisted, the Russians blew it to pieces. So that is the Russian way of war, refracted through the Russian operating code. That's what's unfolding right now.
What will the other Vladimir do? Does he have any options? Well, let me break that into what would appear to be his options. He would appear to have a Ukrainian army, and he would appear to have certain what might be called adjacent army-like units. In other words, special cadres of volunteers who are enthusiasts, especially these groups like the kind of Azov Brigade. That's named after a sea right by Luhansk and Donetsk. These are very inspired and very vicious units. Some of them even have genuinely neo-Nazi ideology, complete with neo-Nazi type paraphernalia. So that's the second group he has. Then he has what appears to be arming the Ukrainian people to resist. Well, if you think about it, none of those are a solution to the problem of masses of artillery blowing your cities to pieces. It's true, you could turn commando units, special forces units, these brigades, loose on the supply lines, such as they are, of the Russian army. But remember, the artillery is all lined up there. And that's just not going to be enough to stop the process I'm talking about. So the Western press is rightly, in a way, celebrating the heroic achievements thus far of these three military elements available to Zelensky. But you can see that they don't have a lot of staying power because they're running out of supplies too. The Russians, you may have noticed, are trying to encircle these cities. So that cuts off supplies to the defenders inside the cities. And then, of course, so that means the cities can be totally enveloped and blown to pieces until they surrender. So I would say that he doesn't have much in terms of long-run military operations. You might say that it's a struggle between two incompetent armies. One is incompetent because it's intrinsic to its culture. The other is incompetent. That's not quite the right word, but it's too small. It's not trained enough.
It's to put together, it's kind of amateurs, if you will. You might have incompetent professionals dealing with inspired amateurs. In the long run, in wars of attrition, it's always the case that an amateur may win 1 or 2 out of 10 battles, but overall, the professionals, even if they're incompetent, will win the war. I once had a friend of mine at the Naval War College. He was somewhat sardonic and cynical. He said the only reason why an army has ever won a war is because all it had to ever fight was another army. In other words, both sides are really incompetent and feckless. Now, I should say that wasn't quite true of the German army. Of course, I'm, in favor, prejudicial for the Navy. It wasn't true of the Navy in the Pacific in World War II, US Navy. And it's not true of the Israeli army. It can be somewhat true of the Israeli Air Force, but I don't want to get into that granular detail. But for the most part, armies only can win victories because all they have to do is fight another army. Now, here you have an army of incompetent, a professional army of incompetence fighting this inspired army of amateurs. In the long run, to paraphrase General Ulysses S. Grant, who had a strategy not unlike the Russian commanders, as he said, my strategy is to wear the bastards down. Right. And so that's what's going on. Now, what is really, therefore, the default position? This is very important. Now, in the last week or two, there have been a barrage of articles in the professional foreign policy, military policy, strategic affairs press about, to use the title of a friend that I know from earlier days, he published this article in the Atlantic about a week ago. This is what he said. Arm the Ukrainians now. Well, when you started reading the article, what he's really saying, support the Ukrainian insurgency that will come as the Russians establish their occupation. So there is now quite a few commentators who in the last week in public venues where the Biden administration puts out the way they want its supporters to think about something. And so there are more articles about the coming Ukrainian insurgency in the last week or so than in years combined. And so that's going on. And I'll get to that in a second, they're planning on having an insurgency. They understand that everything I said about the Russians will ultimately occupy in a somewhat fitful, feckless way, and somewhat reckless way sometimes, a good part of Ukraine, but they'll be kind of spaced out. They won't really be secure. That's a good place to start an insurgency. And it isn't as if they just thought it up. No. Since 2015, the CIA, working with Army Special Forces, have been training Ukrainians, including these brigades that I talked about. Training Ukrainian soldiers, their own Ukrainian special operations, the Ukrainian brigades, in how to undertake an insurgency against the Russian occupation. So that's been training now for 7 years. Now, if I know that, Putin and military intelligence in Russia and the other intelligence agency, the FSB, that Putin was head of, or a career officer in, they know that. And so when they know that the Americans have been arming an insurgency, including people who are ferociously anti-Russian, they know that. And so that, in a way, you might say is the last resort, at least of the Americans, to answering the problem. Now, Zelensky's not going to be in control of that. That requires professionals. And essentially, the Americans will control that insurgency. This is not the first time that there was an insurgency the Americans, the CIA, supported in Ukraine. But I've gone on a bit too long, so I'll love to, for the viewers, ask a question.
But let me ask you about this insurgency, because there's also been a lot of talk about no-fly zones, about other countries coming in, about various nuclear options. You know, you've heard people talking about it going nuclear. And then you had just yesterday, or maybe today, Lindsey Graham saying Putin should be assassinated. And I heard Stephen Blank say in an interview that the US should sponsor essentially a military coup in Russia to oust Putin. So what about those alternatives?
Well, this Ukrainian crisis has wonderfully concentrated the minds of everybody who has ever had anything whatever to say about military affairs, strategic affairs, East Central Europe affairs, NATO affairs, everybody who has ever had anything to say professionally and now are saying something. And of course, the media permit anybody to say something anywhere. Well, not anywhere, but at least somewhere. So of course, all sorts of people are talking. Now you notice most of the people that you mentioned a moment ago, they're not making the decisions. I mean, it'd be like me talking. I'm not making any decisions, but everything I've said thus far was looking at actual American decision makers like the CIA, the US Army. So some of that stuff is just talk, talk, talk. What people tend to do, scholars or specialists, they are specialists in something. They patiently wait for years when what they're interested in, nobody else is interested in. Then all of a sudden, the hinge of fate, the turn of the kaleidoscope finally turns to them. And suddenly their specialty is on it has its 15 minutes of fame, or more likely it's 2 weeks of the news cycle. Everybody wants to interview them. This is wonderful. And they talk. And Lindsey Graham, of course, he will talk about anything that he thinks the public's interested in at that point. But all of these people are simply not serious. They're talkers, they're not walkers. And so all of that stuff is not serious until we get some indication it is part of the strategic culture and the operating code of an important part of the American national security bureaucracy, i.e. one of the military services or of the CIA or of the NSA or of the DIA or in its own way of the FBI. Now, when we get some indication that they're interested in no-fly zones, then that'll be serious. The truth of the matter is they don't want a no-fly zone. They know that somebody has to, they went through this vis-a-vis Russia and Turkey in the first year of the Syrian war. That is, in the year 2011, 2012, there was all sorts of discussion. The United States, using its aircraft based in Erzurum, which is a US base in East Central Turkey, they'd fly a no-fly zone. So people were babbling about that, but they were all babblers. They had no responsibility. That was immediately vetoed by the US Army and the US Air Force, because they did not want to first have the Turks, who were already beginning to get these rather excellent Russian anti-aircraft systems, but they didn't, and the Russians were coming in, they didn't want to get a confrontation either with Turks manning Russian anti-aircraft systems or with the Russians themselves. Well, the same calculation is here. The people already, the Biden administration has made official statements, no fly zone. So that's just babble. The assassination, well, that, of course, that's the CIA did that attempt, although they failed. It's actually extremely rare that the CIA has ever been able to produce an assassination of a foreign leader. And I can assure you, Putin is well aware that maybe they would like to do to him what they tried to do to Castro, some 60 years ago, and failed. And so that's another bit of babble. No, no. The important thing, I think, is the insurgency, and that's related to the last thing you said. Removing Putin by promoting a military coup. That's more operational. That's what people in this or that branch of the administration is thinking of. After all, the United States had ample experience of that in Latin America over many decades. And here's what they are thinking of. This is very subtle, and you had to read the interviews and the responses of the people in the room listening to them, as say the officials, to get a sense of this. It is a fact that the top military commanders, including the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the Russian General Staff, they're very uncomfortable with two decisions that Putin has made in the last 10 days. And they don't think those decisions, which I could identify, they don't think those decisions are in the Russian national interest as defined by the Russian national security establishment.
Could you identify them?
Yes. They had no objection to the decisions that Putin made on the 21st of February, at the end of his first speech. That decision was to recognize Luhansk and Donetsk and to send Russian troops in to defend that. That could be defended in the Russian military's definition of Russian national interest. However, there was in the second speech the specific instruction to begin the special military operation. But that was a massive invasion from several different directions of Ukraine. They didn't want that because they knew they had these logistical problems. They'd get bogged down. They didn't want that. And then what they really didn't want, you could see it on the expressions of the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the Russian General Staff, when Putin, this was all choreographed on TV, on Sunday last, he gave the directive to these two top officials to, as he said, activate our deterrent system to a regime of special operation. That very vague phrase, but that's jargon for going on high alert. And within high alert, there is a protocol to release the safety catches that stretch both in the American nuclear force and the Russian nuclear force, all the way from the president, the respective presidents, down to the respective missilemen. There's a chain of command, and there are safety catches along the way. And under the high alert, some of those safety catches are released. And he made it clear he was thinking of nuclear weapons. And in the next day or so, some of his other spokespeople actually referred to nuclear weapons. That is a big no. You're not supposed to use the word nuclear. The professionals in all the militaries know that. So that you could see when he directed them, all of Russia was watching on RT, Russian television, they were distinctly uncomfortable. Now the CIA and probably their equivalents within the military, the service intelligence agencies, they saw that. And that gives them the idea, well, now some officers in the military are saying up until that point, they say first the invading all of Ukraine, and then second, the nuclear thing. Up to that point, everything he did was in keeping with, as I'd earlier said, the definition of Russian national interest as defined by the Russian national security establishment, including the military. At those 2 points, he differed. from that.
Wait, let me
And,
stop you there. Why do you think he differed?
oh, well, it's very simple. The explanation is embedded in a few clauses in those otherwise impeccable historical and kind of national definitions of what he was doing. In the first one, he alluded to an odd incident that had occurred in Odessa in April or May of 2014, in the midst of all of the initial action and reaction, pro-Ukrainian demonstrations, pro-Russian demonstrations, after the overthrow of the Russian-leaning president, replacement by American proteges, and the Russian annexation of Crimea. There was about 2 or 3 months of demonstrations all over Ukraine. And there was a demonstration in Odessa. And Odessa was right in the midst of, historical Ukraine. It was a very pro-Ukrainian city, but there was a pro-Russian demonstration. Well, there weren't really enough pro-Russians in Odessa for that to be spontaneous. That demonstration was organized by the FSB, the Russian security forces. Well, not surprisingly, that demonstration then provoked a much larger pro-Ukrainian anti-Russian demonstration. And then they beat up in the streets the pro-Russian ones, and the pro-Russian ones retreated into a big building, the trade unions building, about 4 or 5 stories. They were bottled up there. And then the pro-Ukrainian demonstrators threw Molotov cocktails in through the windows, 1st and 2nd story of the building. This meant about 120 pro-Russian demonstrators, including the FSB organizers, fried and died. Putin, in all things, spent 2 or 3 paragraphs of his speech on Monday the 21st alluding to that. And this is what he said. We know who they are, those terrorists who killed people who were for Russia. We're going to track them down and bring them to justice. Well, the military doesn't consider that worth engaging military operations, but there's one agency in the Russian national security establishment that does. It's the FSB, because it was FSB officers who were killed. And we know the FSB has part of its operational code, like most of the intelligence services over there, revenge. You take out some of our people, we take out your people, no matter how long it takes. That's the operational code of the FSB. It's not unique to them, but it's longstanding. The KGB did it. Before that, the MBD. Before that, the NKVD. This is the operating code. The military thought at that moment, he's doing this because he's not because he's a Russian president of all of Russia. He's doing this because he identifies with the FSB. He had been a KGB career officer. He had been director of the FSB during the 1990s under Yeltsin. That's what they thought. Now, remember, armies don't like intelligence services and vice versa. So they're naturally inclined to think anything the FSB wants, that's not good for Russia. But that fact that Putin zeroed in on that grievance of the FSB when he makes this announcement of something that otherwise was in Russian national interest, that's all. That's exactly very much the sort of thing that the military would think, that's more FSB. That's Putin with his FSB identity that goes beyond Putin as with the Russian identity. Then it got worse in the Thursday decision, which was the special military operation. Now, if you're only want to get those people in Odessa or some other cities that had somehow killed pro-Russian people, then you'd send in special forces, commandos, FSB, special forces and commandos. In the dead of night, you track them down in the addresses, drag them out, kill them in a dramatic way so people understand you don't screw around with the FSB. But no, on Thursday, the special military operation was to overthrow the Ukrainian government, to end the militaristic and neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. this would mean you'd have to, it wouldn't be a commando operation. You'd have to go in, occupy the city, overthrow the government, rather like what the Soviet army did, one country after another. In 1945, 46 in Central Europe, what they did in Budapest in 1956, what they did in Prague in 1968, what they did in Kabul in 1979. All of this is a big quantum leap in a military operation. For what? For what? Well, from the point of view of the Russian military, well, they're militaristic. What does that mean? I mean, our military is so much bigger. That doesn't mean anything. But even more, they don't really think there are important neo-Nazis running the Ukrainian government. Oh, they're present, but that's pretty minor. Professionals take that in their stride. We don't get excited and go to war for that. But from the point of view of the FSB, heir to the KGB, heir to the MBD, they know something happened. They knew something happened, not just to the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, but the original Nazis in Ukraine. And that was this, that in the entire history of the Soviet Union, the official history of the Soviet Union was from 1922, that's when it's founded. It was founded by uniting the three Russias, Great Russia, Little Russia, and White Russia into the Soviet Union from 1922 until its official beginning to its official end, when the Soviet flag comes down from the Kremlin and the new Russian flag is hoisted on Christmas Day, 1991. During that entire period, there were, of course, demonstrations, protests, even some violence against the Soviet rulers in some locale or at the time. But it was always put down very quickly, but with one exception. From the period of 1944 to 1953, that's a long time, there was a sustained insurgency in Ukraine. Actually, it was only in the Western Ukraine, where the Azov battalion comes from, and where there's all sorts of neo-Nazis in the area around the major city in Western Ukraine, Lviv. That was sustained for 9 years. In that insurgency, it wasn't just longer, it was bigger than all the other insurgencies, violences in the Soviet Union's history combined. In the course of that, 12,000 MBD, that was the name of the security service at that time, MBD security soldiers and officers died, not just casualties, fatalities. There were about 100,000 casualties. This was a big time war. And the MBD, succeeded by the KGB, succeeded by the FSB, that's part of their lore. They're always looking for Nazis or neo-Nazis based in Western Ukraine, but getting power in the rest of Ukraine because they have a grudge against them. I'd have a grudge against them if they'd killed 12,000 of my predecessors in my wonderful agency. And remember, Putin would have learned all of that as a young KGB officer going to the KGB Academy in the late 70s. He'd be reminded of that as director of the successor, the FSB, in the 1990s. Well, the military knows all of that. The only reason he's using that neo-Nazi thing is that he believes it, but only somebody who has the obsession of the FSB would think that's important.
Now, that insurgency from 1944 to 1953, was that US backed?
That's very important because I mentioned the CIA had been preparing for an insurgency when the Russians occupy Ukraine. They've been preparing for now 7 years. And now it's all in the newspapers. I mean, not the newspapers, the quality media, the policy media, that this is going to happen. And as I said, Putin knows about that. Well, of course, he also knows that from the period 1948-49 to 1953, that Ukrainian, or actually more accurately, Western Ukrainian insurgency was backed to the hilt by the CIA. And so he thinks, and all those KGB officers think, that's a FSB officers now, all they think, there they go again. They're going to have another insurgency. And they knew that the strategy of the CIA back then, wasn't to actually defeat the Soviet forces. They knew that was not going to happen. By the time they came in, the local Ukrainian insurgency was already beginning to weaken. No. What they did, their whole strategy, and this is well known, strategy wasn't to defeat the Soviets, but to bleed them, to kind of cause so much discontent that maybe the Soviet military would overthrow Stalin. That didn't work out so well. But you notice the strategy was to bleed the Russian security forces. Well, actually, that's the language being now used in the articles today. The strategy behind arm the Ukrainians now, the strategy behind that is to bleed the Russians so that it causes so much discontent. Oh, that then maybe the military will overthrow Putin.
All right. So then you don't think there's actually a danger of nuclear war over this?
We didn't even get to that. That was, remember, that was the third thing on last Sunday. That's when it wasn't a speech, it was a choreographed directive from him to his two top defense people. And I said they were distinctly uncomfortable. So that itself is very, very problematic in their minds. And of course, the CIA and the American other agencies, knowing that, here's what they think. They think that first, the military has been discontented for three different things, escalating things, if you will, that Putin has done since Monday, the 21st of February. Three different things. But the KGB wasn't unhappy. The FSB was not unhappy with the first two things. But even the SSB doesn't think that you should go to nuclear war. Now they think, see, he's got all the agencies very uneasy about him, questioning his judgment. Now they know something that the discerning can actually see, but most commentary is not talking about, which I could mention in detail.
Well, tell us, what is it?
Okay. Now here it's composed of two parts. Here is one part. Everybody is talking about, oh, well, Putin is isolated. He's all isolated and he's not getting any advice, and he's getting unhinged because of that. Because after all, when people get isolated, they get cabin fever and they get unhinged. Many of us have friends. Perhaps our friends think many of us have been isolated and unhinged during the 2 years of the coronavirus isolation. So we have to understand that. So that's well known. And it's reinforced by the fact of the curiosity of the way Putin holds his meetings. Now, you would think if he's holding a meeting, remember all of Russia is watching on TV, giving directive to his top two military officials about go on high alert. You would think he would want to make sure nothing got lost in translation because there was too much social distance. Well, all his meetings, be they with the president of France, the chancellor of Germany, or be it with his National Security Council, or be it with these two leading defense officials, all these meetings have been with him at an immense social distance. Normally is at a table, a very long table. He's at one end, and his defense ministers or his national security people, they're at the opposite end. And how could they possibly hear each other? Maybe something might get lost in, as I say, in the social distance. But why does he do that? Well, it's clear that he is a COVID phobe. You might think, well, COVID phobe, Donald Trump, he got COVID, took that in stride, no problem. Boris Johnson, he got COVID, he took that in stride, no problem. Well, yes, but they don't really think that someone in their cronies, somebody in those agencies under them, might want to do them in or take over. But of course, every Russian leader knows that. You know, it is not good if you're a Russian leader to get sick, to be weak. At that moment, they could strike. So he doesn't dare get sick. That's why, that's the rational reason to be a COVID phobe. If I were in Russia and the leader, I'd be a COVID phobe too.
Especially since Stalin had the doctor's plot.
That's
so
exactly. And you see, that brings up another point. I mean, you don't get sick. You don't go because, well, maybe your cronies, that your drinking buddies who have been so loyal to you, then all of a sudden, as the Death of Stalin movie wonderfully depicted, well, you get sick and they allow you to be sick hour after hour until you die. And maybe your intelligence chief, Beria then, wants to speed up the process. So they all know that. So he doesn't dare get sick. But then there's another element. This is the thing that is not talked about much. Now, I noticed that in these recent speeches, but especially on that Sunday directive, that his physical appearance had a certain oddity about it. Now, in the speeches, he had a lot of affect. You know, I mean, it was sort of like he was a professor. His eyes were alert and that sort of thing. But most of all, his face, although more puffy than in the past, wasn't really that different. But in the Sunday time, he was almost like he was kind of a robot, no affect. His voice was very steady, no emotion. Of course, it's a big topic, going to first alert. His eyes were sort of dim, but most of all, his face was puffy. His face was puffy. Well, now, I wonder about our viewers, if they've known from time to time people whose face is puffy. And what were the circumstances? Well, it happens that I know some people. It's because they were getting regular steroid shots. Regular steroid shots. Regular steroid shots, repeated steroid shots, will cause some side effects. One of the noticeable thing is a puffiness in the face. But the important thing is not what's outside the skull, but inside. What are the mental side effects? That's the question. Well, we've all heard the term road rage. Road rage. Have you heard the term roid rage? And what is roid rage? Do you know what roid rage is? As in steroid? Well, it turns out the professionals in administering steroids and the professionals in treating the side effects of steroids know about the real phenomenon of roid rage. That is to say, a particular personality disorders amongst people who have taken repeated and continuing doses of steroids. Specifically, this is the clinical description. That's not something from the State Department or the military of the United States or whatever. No, here's a clinical description. They become angry and aggressive. They become impulsive, even impetuous. Well, this is the first time in the history of the nuclear era. It's the first nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, 77 years ago, the first time we've had somebody who is clinically angry and aggressive, impulsive and impetuous because of medical conditions. Well, Khrushchev had a little bit of that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it wasn't intrinsic to his physical condition. That is something that should get all of our attention.
So what do you think there is or is not a possibility of a nuclear conflict coming out of this? Do you think there is or is not a chance of a nuclear?
Increases the probability. This is the first time we've had such a person with his finger near the red button. In other words,
What about President Biden? What's his mental state?
well, here you have a fascinating case. We have President Biden. We've never had a president before that has had such cognitive impairment. So this is an amazing case. The two major nuclear powers, one leader is intelligent, has all of his cognitive processes, but they're distorted by his anger, impetuousness, etc. In other words, he's intelligent, but a little bit a little bit psychologically impaired. Then we have another guy who's probably psychologically perfectly normal, but he has no intelligence. So these are the two leaders with their finger on the button. That's a very dangerous situation.
Okay, let me change topic a little bit. I want to just say two things, and we'll try and wrap it up in 5 minutes. Years ago, I was a Fulbright exchange professor in Uzbekistan. I had some students, and I was amazed for such a repressive society. About 20% of them, although Uzbekistan at that point, this was in 2002, 2003, allied to the United States. They, doing some polling in class, about 20% were pro-Bin Laden and thought it was great that the World Trade Center was blown up, et cetera. And I asked them, well, what do you think is going to happen now? And they said to me, so it must have come from official doctrine because they didn't make it up. First, we drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Next, we'll drive you out of Afghanistan. Then Russia and America will fight, and Islam will pick up the pieces and rule the world. And that stuck with me for 20 years. So I'm seeing Russia was kicked out of Afghanistan. Now America's been kicked out of Afghanistan. Now Russia and America are fighting. At the same time, Biden wants to give an atom bomb to Iran. And in all these scenarios of conflict, China is sort of out of it, Africa's out of it, Asia's out of it. You've heard Whoopi Goldberg go, white people fighting she didn't care about. And it's almost as if somebody wanted to destroy European civilization, and then Islam and China and the rest would pick up the pieces. Is that paranoid, or do you think there's some evidence for that?
Well, I do think, even though these were students in Uzbekistan, they got it more right than all the professionals in the West combined. In other words, with one amendment, which I'll make, but the amendment only comes at the end of their sequence. Obviously, the Islamists drove the Russians first and then the Americans out of Afghanistan. That was actually intrinsic. It was notorious for 2,500 years, ever since Alexander the Great discovered this, that Afghanistan was the graveyard of empires. And then if you added an Islamist dimension on top of it, then that's on order of magnitude. So that was nothing unusual about that, except most of the American elites didn't think that. Well, it turned out your former students were. Well, then, of course, the Russians and Americans are going at it, and they understood these dynamics. They understand the dynamics of geopolitics. If you are a small country and a small people in the midst of all the geopolitics, global politics of a giant land power and a giant sea power, you understand these things because you have to survive.
Let me stop you there. Every single one of those students had read Halford Mackinder and Mahan and Huntington's Clash of Civilizations.
Those were the go-to books, except the American elites never went to them. But you see, that's why you could have Uzbek undergraduates, much
they
more
were graduates, some of them.
Much more intelligent than all the professionals in the West, for the most part, combined. Now, then they said Islam will inherit the earth. Well, you said China a moment ago, China is out of it. It's not out of it. They know everything that's happening. And they know that there is that Iran that is also a revisionist power. And the strategy of the Chinese is, well, we know what they want to do, and we'll allow them to do it, to knock out the American allies still remaining in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and Israel, maybe even some nuclear weapons, no problem from our point of view. And then we'll allow them to go ahead. And then at a certain point, if they're still active and alive, but they're getting off our reservation, we know how to handle that. But more likely, they'll run out of steam, and then everything will be discredited except us. That is to say, China, the civilization that's the oldest of all, even more old than the Persian one, goes back 2,500 years, and the Chung Kuo Central Kingdom will be the central kingdom, not just of East Asia, as it was for 2,500 years, until the 100 years of humiliation from the West, but it will be the Chung Kuo of the entire globe itself. And we're already linking that up with our Belt and Road Initiative. We're linking that up with our getting all these other countries, including these other revisionist powers, Russia and Iran, dependent upon us for our markets, for their oil. So you see, the Islamists think they'll inherit the earth. They're just brand new, coming brand new, 700 AD. That's just a bunch of adolescents. No. The Chinese, 2,500 years.
So do you think the eventual end of this will be a major war in Europe or not? What do you predict happens? Will it be said at the last one, bag, whimper, or World War III? Well, the whimper, I think, is out, although you say there may still be a whimper, but we've certainly had a bang. The question is, do we go to World War III?
Well, that's the question. And what I find disturbing is that each week something happens that, in my mind, increases the probability that we'll go to war. Now, you asked me to make a prediction. This is not the way, that's not the kind of methodology or epistemology amongst the people that I've been talking about. You know, military strategist, foreign policy analyst, international political analyst. That's not the way we think. We don't make a prediction either or. We assign probabilities to something, and we recalculate the probabilities through a process of iteration as we get new facts that therefore will shift the probability. You might say we think like a kind of investors in private equity or in hedge funds. They have a balanced portfolio. Well, we have a balance. They predict different things, and they also hedge their possible losses from, an array of maybe 10, a dozen, or maybe more investments. Well, I have 10 or 12 particular alternative futures, and I can assign a probability to them. What you're really interested in is when I assign the probability, let's say, of going to nuclear war, to all the other things combined, which would be non-nuclear war, I still think that the probability of non-nuclear war is higher. The probability of no nuclear war is higher than the probability of nuclear war. But as I say, the probability is now much higher today than it was on, let's say, Sunday, the 20th of February. And I've mentioned reasons why.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think that was very insightful, and I hope in a few weeks we'll be able to see what happened and come back for more, because this is like an ongoing series. I just want to plug your book one more time, which is The American Way of Empire, How America Won a World but Lost Her Way. I also wanted you to say just one or two words. You are writing a new book, and in general, what will the focus of that book be? What will the theme be?
Well, the theme will be to continue the stages of the crisis, of the coronavirus catastrophe, the successive crises. And notice when I was mentioning the four crises thus far, the medical, the economic, the political, and the strategic, all of those have prototypes at some point or another in the history of major countries, either in the modern era or the modern and the medieval era, or the modern and the medieval or the ancient era. There's all sorts of historical prototypes. But of course, the worse it gets, the fewer prototypes there are. although it looked pretty grim for the West and all the countries in the West in 1918, 1921, and in 1945 to 47. You had certainly gotten into a strategic crisis, otherwise called World War I or World II, but in addition, you once had something beyond that. What you had in the defeated powers was the disintegration, not surprisingly, of the defeated militaries. And you even had splits within the military, so that in some countries you actually had civil wars, most obviously in Russia. A little bit more complicated in Germany. In Austria-Hungary, you had breaking apart into succeeding countries with little armies running around all over. And so you had following the strategic crisis, if there was a defeat or debacle, then you had a military crisis. Sounds like they're the same. The strategic crisis is actually what happens overseas to the military over there. But if it's defeated or a debacle, it loses its raison d'etre. It loses its esprit de corps. It begins to break apart. So the military itself fragments, just like the earlier political system and the earlier economic system and the earlier, if you will, medical system. It fragments. That's very dangerous. When that happens, you're on the edge of civil war. We already see in America today, not the military system fragmenting, becoming paralyzed, immobilized, but just look at the police systems in the major cities today. They're not operating anywhere. I mean, you have crime, you have violence, you have kind of the homeless having their problems on the streets. You have disorder in the large American cities that has not been seen in the entire history of these American cities, because that's not the way a city, civilization, is supposed to be. We already have barbarism in the center of a large number of American cities. I'm especially sensitive to this because I was born and reared in Oregon, and it's especially obvious in Portland. But it's also obvious in Los Angeles and in San Francisco and Seattle. It's obvious in Philadelphia. It's obvious in parts of New York. It's obvious in Minneapolis, certainly obvious in Chicago, and on, although those are the biggies. And so you already have a societal breakdown. That's the next crisis after the military. Societal breakdown in the heart of many of our cities. That's going to spread because the breakdown of the police will then be superseded by the breakdown of the much more important security forces if they suffer a defeat or a debacle overseas in Ukraine or the Baltics or whatever. That could happen. And so I do believe that's not inevitable. Along all these crises, there was always an off-ramp that the political leadership of the day could have taken. They could have taken an off-ramp on the medical crisis that it wouldn't have issued in the economic one, but they sped on past and therefore produced the economic crisis, and so on and so on and so on. Now, there are off-ramps. So the United States military and more broadly NATO doesn't have a debacle or defeat vis-a-vis Ukraine, but they're speeding on. They're speeding on, and so that could happen. And then it certainly would happen if there were a nuclear war. And then that means the military would break down. And then at that point, there's what's left to hold law and order in the society. What will happen if there's no law and order? Then there's a war of all against all. And that means the powerful, the one, as Thomas Hobbes, who wrote his major book about this, he wrote it in the midst of the Civil War in England in 1640. And he said, when there's no Leviathan, no authority, no law and order, clubs are trumps. In other words, the people who will rule the streets and the big cities and the small towns will be the biggest and baddest thugs. That's the societal breakdown. So that's happened. That happened in the 2 or 3 years after the end of the First World War and after the end of the Second World War, until the American and British French armies came in on one side and the Russian army came and imposed a certain law and order, put an end to the anarchy. Well, that may not be happening. The Chinese are going to set back when this happens in the Western countries. And so that's that. And then comes the Seven Crisis, which I can only say has happened twice before. And that is the New Dark Age. When society breaks down, then we get a Dark Age. And there have been 2 Dark Ages in the past. let's say, widespread dark ages. You might say pandemic dark ages. And that was the breakdown of the then global economy and the globalized civilization of the Bronze Age. This all happened around 22 BC. Then there was a 500-year dark age. The second dark age was, but there had been globalization. The thing that really confirms it is when the globalization breaks down, then everybody who had earlier might have been self-sufficient, you know, a polis here, a little small empire there, because of the new globalization, they were no longer that. So when that breaks down all of a sudden, then everything reverts to just very primitive, very dark, very impoverished. And for 500 years, there was the first dark age. Then with the breakdown of the Roman Empire, that was the second globalization. When that broke down, 500 years for dark age. Well, our globalization is breaking down now, and everything that the globalization funded, that is, say, the economy that funded the industries, the education, the culture, and above all, the militaries, the law and order, that's all breaking down. And if that continues, then we will have something really unusual. We've only had 2 global dark ages in the past, and maybe that's coming down the pike.
Well, that's certainly something to think about, and I hope that we can somehow take an off-ramp that will get us to avoid that possibility. We'll just have to stay tuned, and I certainly look forward to your completing that book and reading it as soon as possible. I want to thank you again. I want to hold up the book one more time. If anybody wants to get it, it's at Amazon, and public libraries can order it for you. Audible as an audiobook, Kindle, all formats, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore can order it. I want to thank you and wish you well, and we'll come back hopefully at a future date and see where we stand. I have to say, the last time we talked, I didn't think it would come to this. Now it has, and I just hope that someone with some good sense can work out some kind of reasonable compromise like people used to do in the old days. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was 60 years ago exactly, 1962, and people being very frightened. And we read a book about it in your class, 13 Days, and it was a big lodestone of everyone's analysis of international affairs. I never thought we'd be living through something so close to that again, certainly not after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but here we are. And I want to wish you good health, and that you don't need to sit like Putin at a long table not to get infected, and that next time we talk, we have happier news. But thank you. And again, we look forward to seeing how this develops.